Hey everybody, this is a book by Patrick Murray and Jeanne Schuler titled Philosophical and Political Consequences of the Critique of Political Economy, Recognizing Capital. I don't know how much of this book I'm going to read, but I do want to read the introduction. Patrick Murray, the one time when I reached out to him was very nice to me, so I like him. What was I going to say? His book, The Mismeasure of Wealth, is fantastic. His wife, Jeanne Schuler, I don't know much about her work, but I haven't read any of it independently. But I'm sure it's fantastic. The book is dedicated to Ted and Mary Louise Schuler in memory and gratitude. The acknowledgments say, several of our teachers have had a lasting influence on us. We both studied with James Collins at St. Louis University. Dr. Collins supervised Patrick's dissertation, Marx's theory of, quote, Wissenschaft, and taught him much about working as a historian of modern philosophy. His presence is enduring. Richard Blackwell created the doctoral program in the philosophy of science at St. Louis University, from which Patrick graduated. He was a beloved teacher and mentor. Albert William Levi directed Jeanne's dissertation, Logics of Theoretical and Practical Reason in G.W.F. Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit at Washington University. For years, he and his wife, Uta Levi, graciously opened their home as a Friday afternoon salon. Paul Picone joined the sociology department at Washington University and brought the journal Telos to St. Louis, opening new worlds of critical thought. With Dan Dahlstrom, we studied Marx's Grundrisse, and with Picone once the full English translation appeared. Picone encouraged Patrick to study in Frankfurt as a DAD Fulbright Fellow. In Frankfurt, Patrick took the opportunity to learn from many teachers, including Jürgen Habermas and several of Theodor Adorno's students. Rudiger Bubner was especially supportive. 5 philosophers whom we came to know in St. Louis took an interest in our work and have been a great resource and support over the decades. Peter Fuss let Patrick audit his course at the University of Missouri St. Louis on Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, where Patrick was first exposed to Fuss's translation of the Phenomenology, on which John Dobbins would collaborate. Patrick and Jeanne kept talking with Fuss about Hegel, Dante, Kant, Rousseau, Arendt, Marx, and more. James Marsh was a reader of both our dissertations. We kept learning from Marsh's phenomenological approach to critical theory after he left for Fordham University. Tom Janot, Janot, I guess is how you actually say it. That's how I might guess. Wrote his dissertation on Marx under Marsh's supervision. Who wrote his dissertation on Marx under James Marsh's supervision, has long taken an interest in our work. We are grateful for Janot's exuberant and humane intelligence. Dan Dahlstrom has been a friend and a model of intellectual passion and integrity since he and Patrick started graduate school at St. Louis University. John F. Kavanaugh, S.J., was an inspiration, an unfailing advocate for our work, and a dear friend. We want to acknowledge the members of the International Symposium on Marxian Theory, ISMT, which began with Fred Mosley organized a working conference on Marx's method and capital at Mount Holyoke College in 1991. There were 8 participants: Chris Arthur, Martha Campbell, Guglielmo Mino Carcetti, Paul Maddock, Fred Mosley, Gert Reuten, Tony Smith, and Patrick. What was intended as a one-time event became an annual one with week-long working conferences every summer for the next 22 years. Over the years, some people left and others joined the group, including Riccardo Bellafiore, Andrew Brown, Roberto Fineschi, Guido Starosta, and Nicola Taylor. Jeanne, who was reading conference papers all along, and our colleague Amy Wendling participated in the last conference held at Creighton University in 2014. We thank all the members of the International Symposium on Marxian Theory for their generosity, critical minds, and dedication to the work. Over the years, other scholars helped to develop philosophical and political consequences of the critique of political economy, recognizing capital. including Christina Achinger, who was Moishe Postone's wife when he died, Anne Pomeroy, Pete Amato, Dennis Badine, Samuel Chambers, Ruth Groff, Joseph Fraccia, Peter Hudis, Andrew Kleiman, Dan Creer, Judy Levin, Bill Martin, George McCarthy, Eric John Russell, and Michael J. Thompson. We have benefited from association with several scholarly groups and publications, beginning with the St. Louis Telos Group. We have been involved in the American Catholic Philosophical Association. Each of us served on its executive committee. We served as coordinators of the Radical Philosophy Association and regularly attend the RPA's biennial conferences. Sebastian Budge and other editors of the journal Historical Materialism took an interest in Patrick's work when the journal was in formation. We regularly attend historical materialism conferences. The British Marx and Philosophy Society has sponsored talks by Patrick. We spoke at the 40th anniversary celebration of the Cambridge Journal of Economics, and Patrick spoke at the 45th anniversary celebration. Our essay, titled Reclaiming the Concepts of Value and Capital, was presented by Patrick in Nanjing, People's Republic of China, at Hohai University and at Nanjing University. We thank Hohai's University Vice President Tang Hongwu and Professor Zhang Yibing at Nanjing University for their kind invitations. We thank Dr. Wu Jing of Hohai University, who published a Chinese translation of the article Reclaiming the Concepts of Value and Capital in Nanjing Social Science. We are fortunate to work in a diverse and intellectually alive philosophy department. We are grateful to our Crichton colleagues and former colleagues in philosophy, J.J. Abrams, Michael Brown, Jack Carlson, Elizabeth Cook, Charles Doherty, Rudolph Fiesel, Patricia Fleming, Sam Gavin, Kevin Graham, Sr., Mary Alice Haley, RSM, Jeffrey House, Thomas Kiefer, Thomas Kredick, S.J., Chris McCord, David McPherson, Ann Ozar, Chris Pliotska, Ross Romero, S.J., Eugene Selk, William O. Stevens, Amy Wendling, Richard White, and Jinmei Yuan. We thank other Crichton colleagues for their support: Fidel Fajardo Acosta, Sue Califf, Bet Evans, Maorong Jiang, Richard Miller, Ron Simpkins, Ryan Wishart, and participants in the Kennefic Chair Reading Group. To Crichton's College of Arts and Sciences, we are grateful for sabbaticals, funding for research and travel, and for hosting 2 ISMT conferences and 1 RPA conference. We thank our deans and associate deans who have generously supported our work. We have enjoyed the friendship and support of the St. Louis community where we once lived. Michael Bartz, Trish Curtis, Judy Gallagher, Mary Beth Gallagher, Michael Goka, Julie Kirksick, Sharon McMullen, Mark Nielsen, and Kathy Nolan. We have benefited from years of conversation with John Dugan, Renee Haybach, Wolfgang Richter Girard, and Dan Semrod. In 1975, Patrick met Moishe Postone at Goethe University in Frankfurt, Germany. Patrick and Jeanne became friends with Moishe, and we shared decades of conversation until Moishe's death in 2018. We gained much from Moishe's force of mind and depth of understanding. At Palgrave Macmillan, we thank Michael J. Thompson, editor of the Political Philosophy and Public Purpose book series, the series Political Philosophy and Public Purpose, for his generous encouragement. For her support and guidance, we thank Madison Allums, Commissioner Editor for U.S. Politics and Political Theory, for expert guidance and her understanding in the production phase of the book. We thank Nandakini Lahiri, Project Manager Books Production. This book would not be possible without our parents' love and support, from Muriel Staney and George Staney, and from Mary Louise Schuler and Ted Schuler, to whom we dedicate this book. We appreciate the unfailing generosity of our siblings and their spouses, Kathy, Sue, Joyce, Scott, Paul, Kevin, Kathleen, Greg, Christine, Kevin, Joe, and Martha. John, Patrick, David, and Savita, our children, grew up while this book was being written. They bring joy into our family, which now includes Isabel Malone and Kara O'Malley, and grandchildren Theodore, Benjamin, and Ocean. Okay. Contents. Introduction. Philosophy and social theory beyond the, quote, bourgeois horizon. With the headings. What are important terms in economics? Bait and switch. 3 questions about wealth. 2 questions about wealth and capitalism. Marx's phenomenological critique of economics. The, quote, bourgeois horizon. 3 types of concepts. Subsumption, shadow forms, and fetishes. Subsumption, capital shadow forms. The commodity, money, and capital fetishes. MacIntyre, Postone, Weber, and Marx, instrumental action or capital. Turning the key of Marx's critique of political economy. Chapter 2, Recognizing Capital, Some Barriers to Public Discourse about Capital. With the headings, Recognizing Capital, What Makes It Hard? What is capital? What makes capital hard to recognize? Recognizing Capital and the, quote, politics of identity, end quote. Critique of Fraser on redistribution and recognition. On capital and the politics of identity and recognition. Conceptual and political blockages and openings to recognizing capital. Getting beyond the conversation stopper. It's the economy, stupid. Appendix. Letter from Patrick Murray to Judith Butler, December 16, 1995. Chapter 3, The Legend of Hegel's Labor Theory of Reason, with the headings, The Work Theory of Reason, A Hegelian Response to the Legend, Consequences for Discourse Ethics. Chapter 4, Marx, Subjectivism and Modern Moral Philosophy, with the headings, Modern Moral Predicament, Subjectivism and Nihilism, Commerce and Nihilism, Counter-Tendencies to the Nihilism of Commerce, Beyond Moral Nihilism. Chapter 5, Karl Marx and the Critique of Bourgeois Philosophy, with the headings, The Bourgeois Market, The Social Basis of Bourgeois Thought, Beyond the Bourgeois Horizon, Conclusion, Toward Better Concepts. Chapter 6, Reclaiming the Concepts of Value and Capital, with the headings, Introduction, Fundamental Concepts and Horizons of Discourse, 5 Misconceptions of Value and Capital. Value is not utility. Value is not utility. Utility is a bogus concept. Value is not use value. Value is not exchange value or price. Capital is not just any resource. McDonald'sization represents real subsumption under capital, not the spread of instrumental reason. Chapter 7, Social Form and the, quote, purely social, end quote, on the kind of sociality involved in value, with the headings, Social Forms and General Traits, Skepticism about Purposes and Forms, Social Forms from Commodities to Value, the Commodity Spectrum, Simple Commodities, Commodities that are Commodity Capital, X-Commodities, Potential Commodities, Quasi-Commodities, from Value to Abstract Labor and Time, from Abstract Labor and Time to Money and Capital. 2 meanings of Marx's description of value as, quote, purely social. More to the story, some qualifications to the, quote, purely social, and, quote, sociality of values. Chapter 8, The Commodity Spectrum, with the headings, Getting to the Form of Commodities, Generalization of the Commodity Form in Capitalist Societies, Refining the Concept of Capitalist Commodities, From Capitalist Commodity to Commodity Capital. The Consequences of Producing Commodities, on a Capitalist Basis, Doubling and Redoubling, Keep the double character of the commodity in mind, how value shapes the usefulness of the commodity, X-commodities, from, quote, simply things to a store of value, quasi-commodities, ideal subsumption and shadow commodities. Chapter 9, A Brilliant Failure, Hegel and Marx assess the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment in Hegel's lectures on the history of philosophy. Enlightenment in the phenomenology of spirit. Enlightenment's victory over naive faith. What lies beyond reflection, the thing in itself. Utility, the truth of enlightenment. From utility to terror. Marx's critique of enlightenment. Capital, the truth of utility. Afterward, Horkheimer's critique of instrumental reason. Chapter 10. From Hegel on enlightenment terror to Marx on capital. Contrasting Hegel and Marx on capitalist society. Hegel's account of how the Enlightenment culminates in the notion of utility. Utility's double masquerade. Comparing Hegel and Marx on the Enlightenment and utility. Chapter 11. The Poetics of Nihilism, representing capital's indifference in Dickens' Hard Times, with the headings Introduction, Literature and Social Theory, Constitutive Forms and Shadow Forms, Art and Philosophy, a Hegelian counterpoint to Dickens, Hard Times in the Grad-Grind Philosophy, the Grad-Grind Philosophy and Utilitarianism, the Harthouse Philosophy is the truth of the Grad-Grind Philosophy, Dickens' Hard Times and Capitalism, Conclusion, taking on capital's shadow forms. Chapter 12, Rebel Without a Cause, Stanley Kubrick and the Banality of the Good, with the headings, Surfing the Zeitgeist, The Skeptical Vision and the Banality of the Good, Skepticism and Capitalism, The Skeptical Tropes of Stanley Kubrick, Skeptical Quote Solutions, Pleasure über alles, The Artist's Response, Create the Meaning that is Missing from the World, The Consolation of False Philosophy. Chapter 13, Disappearing Act, The Trick Philosophy of Woody Allen, How the Factoring Philosophy Makes the World Disappear, Woody Allen's Existentialism, David Hume is the Consummate Trick Philosopher, Skepticism's Instability, Skepticism and Freethinking, Oscillating Incompatibles, Global Skepticism's Philosophical and Artistic Dead Ends, How to Live if All Values are Strictly Subjective, Reflecting on, quote, life's shortness and uncertainty, end quote, Counterworking, quote, the artifice of nature, end quote, Problems with projection theory, but not to worry. Next section is titled Notes on Chapters. Chapter 1, Patrick Murray and Jeanne Schuler, Introduction, Philosophy and Social Theory Beyond the, quote, Bourgeois Horizon, previously unpublished. Chapter 2, Patrick Murray and Jeanne Schuler article, Recognizing Capital, Some Barriers to Public Discourse About Capital, published in Race, Class, and National Identity, edited by Andrew Light and Mecca Nagel in 2000, reprinted with the kind permission of Humanity Books. Appendix to Chapter 2, Patrick Murray, Letter from Patrick Murray to Judith Butler, December 16th, 1995. Chapter 3, Jeanne Schuler, article, The Legend of Hegel's Labor Theory of Reason in Social Philosophy Today, Volume 14. Chapter 4, Patrick Murray and Jeanne Schuler's article, Marx Subjectivism and Modern Moral Philosophy, published in The Modern Schoolman. Chapter 5, Patrick Murray and Jeanne Schuler's article, Karl Marx and the Critique of Bourgeois Philosophy, published in The Modern Schoolman, 2008. Chapter 6, Patrick Murray and Jeanne Schuler, article, Reclaiming the Concepts of Value and Capital, Journal of East-West Thought. Chapter 7, Patrick Murray and Jeanne Schuler, Social Form and the, quote, Purely Social, on the kind of sociality involved in value, published in The Social Ontology of Capital, edited by Dan Creer and Mark P. Worrell. Chapter 8, Patrick Murray and Jeanne Schuler, article, The Commodity Spectrum, published in Continental Thought and Theory, a Journal of Intellectual Freedom, published in Volume 1, Issue 4. Chapter 9, Jeanne Schuler article, A Brilliant Future, Hegel and Marx Assess the Enlightenment, published in International Philosophical Quarterly, 2016. Chapter 10, Patrick Murray and Jeanne Schuler article, From Hegel on Enlightenment Terror to Marx on Capital, previously unpublished. Chapter 11, Patrick Murray and Jeanne Schuler. Paper, The Poetics of Nihilism, Representing Capital's Indifference in Dickens, published in Capital and the Mirror, Critical Social Theory and the Aesthetic Dimension, edited by Dan Creer and Michael P. Worrell. Chapter 12, Patrick Murray and Jeanne Schuler, Rebel Without a Cause, Stanley Kubrick and the Banality of the Good, published in The Philosophy of Stanley Kubrick, edited by Gerald A. Abrams. Chapter 13, Patrick Murray and Jeanne Schuler, Disappearing Act, The Trick Philosophy of Woody Allen, published in The Blackwell Companion to Woody Allen, published in 2012. About the authors. Patrick Murray is John C. Fennick Faculty Chair in the Humanities and Professor of Philosophy at Creighton University, Omaha, Nebraska. He is the author of The Mismeasure of Wealth, Essays on Marx and Social Form, published in 2016, and Marx's Theory of Scientific Knowledge, published in 1988, and the editor of the book Reflections on Commercial Life, an anthology of classic texts from Plato to the present. He is co-author with Jeanne Schuler of the book False Moves in Philosophy and Social Theory, Losing Public Purpose, published in 2023. He is working on a reissue of Marx's Theory of Scientific Knowledge and on the book Capital's Reach, How Capital Shapes and Subsumes. Patrick served on the Executive Council of the American Catholic Philosophical Association and is coordinator of the Radical Philosophy Association. His research interests center on the relationship between capitalism and modern philosophy and include British empiricists Hegel, Marx, and the Frankfurt School. Jeanne Schuler is professor of philosophy at Creighton University, Omaha, Nebraska. Schuler has published in the history of philosophy and critical theory, including articles on Hume, Kant, Hegel, Marx, Arendt, Iris Murdoch, and Habermas. Jeanne Schuler is co-author with Patrick Murray of the book False Moves in Philosophy and Social Theory, Losing Public Purpose, published in 2023. Jeanne Schuler served as on the Executive Council of the American Catholic Philosophical Association and is coordinator of the Radical Philosophy Association. Schuler is working on a series of articles on Hegel and modern philosophy, 4 of which have been published. Alright, so we're here finally at the introduction. Chapter 1, Introduction, Beyond Philosophy and Social Theory, Beyond the, quote, Bourgeois Horizon. Much of modern philosophy and social theory is caught within a horizon of discourse. Marx calls it the, quote, Bourgeois Horizon, and, quote, based on phenomenologically untenable bifurcations. This horizon of discourse excludes recognizing capital, which Marx identifies as the concept central to understanding the modern world. Quote, the exact development of the concept of capital is necessary since it is the fundamental concept of modern economics, just as capital itself, is the foundation of bourgeois society. One second, got to get to the endnotes. Where am I? Come on. And that quote was from Grundrisse. Back to the text. End footnote. Paul Maddock Jr. explains the implication for Marx's critique of political economy. Quote, Marx's critique, his, quote, scientific revolution, therefore involved not merely a reworking of economic categories, but the construction of another set of concepts, explicitly social and historical ones. End quote. Paul Maddock Jr. in the article Marx's Dialectic, published in Marx's Method in Capital, a Reexamination, edited by Fred Mosley. I have a piece by Paul Maddock Jr. on this channel, but I'm not exactly sure which one it is. No, it's not that one. End footnote. By contrast, consider the economist Paul Samuelson's definition of capital goods. Quote, capital goods, then, represent produced goods that can be used as factor inputs for further production, end quote. Paul Samuelson in Economics, 9th edition, published 1973. According to this definition, capital has nothing in particular to do with capitalism or any specific social form of the provisioning process. The general categories of economics, like, quote, produced goods that can be used as factor inputs for further production, end quote, differ from the concept of capital. Capital has specific social and historical content. The, quote, bourgeois horizon, end quote, allows no cognitive space for a concept like capital. The seminal idea of Marx's historical materialism states, a mode of production, Produktionsweise, must not be considered simply as being the reproduction of the physical existence of the individuals. Rather, a mode of production is a definite form of activity of these individuals, a definite form of expressing their life, a definite way of life, Lebensweise, on their part, end quote. Marx, German ideology. Whatever this way of life is, it is inseparable from the mode of production, and it will be fraught with moral, social, and political consequences. Recognizing the inseparability of mode of production and way of life is the phenomenological breakthrough of Marx's historical materialism. The bifurcating, quote, bourgeois horizon, end quote, does not recognize this inseparability. Consequently, it treats a mode of production, quote, simply as being the reproduction of physical existence of the individuals, end quote. In splitting the provisioning process from its constitutive social form and purpose, the, quote, bourgeois horizon, end quote, posits an economy in general and thereby falls into the, quote, illusion of the economic, end quote. Economics takes this impossible economy in general as the object of its inquiry. This is why capital is unrecognizable within the, quote, bourgeois horizon, end quote, and absent from economics. As Moise Postone puts it, Marx offers a critique of political economy, not a critical political economy. Footnote. See Moise Postone, Time, Labor, and Social Domination, a reinterpretation of Marx's critical theory, published in 1993. Time, Labor, and Social Domination is the seminal English language contribution to the new reading of Marx, what Germans call Die Neue Marx-Lektura. On Die Neue Marx-Lektura, see Riccardo Bellafiore and Tommaso Rodolfi Riva. Die Neue Marx-Lektura, putting the critique of political economy back into the critique of society. I believe that piece is on this channel. No, it's not. Wait, is it? Yeah, or there's a piece, yeah, no, it is. It is on this channel. Anyway, back to the text, still reading the footnote here. The new interpretation understands Marx to be a critic of political economy, including of the classical Ricardian labor theory of value. The classical theory is based on a transhistorical conception of labor, and has no idea of why value must be expressed as money. Werner Bonafelt and Chris O'Kane developed the critique of political economy as critical social theory. See Werner Bonafelt's book, Critical Theory and the Critique of Political Economy, and Werner Bonafelt and Chris O'Kane's book, Adorno and Marx, Negative Dialectics and the Critique of Political Economy, published in 22. Interpreting Marx as a critic of political economy enables us to see the new reading as a branch of the Frankfurt School that reaches back to Theodor Adorno and his students, Alfred Schmidt, Hans-Georg Backhaus, Helmut Reichelt, and Hans-Jürgen Kroll. The essays collected in the present volume explore the philosophical and political significance of the critique of political economy as critical theory. End footnote. What Postone calls traditional or Ricardian Marxism is a version of critical political economy. It operates within the, quote, bourgeois horizon, end quote. It treats labor and capitalism as if it were labor in general, which presupposes the phenomenological false move of splitting labor from labor's constitutive social form and purpose. The crux of Marx's critique of political economy is that it fails to make constitutive social forms and purposes ingredients of its theory. The classical Ricardian labor theory of value, which is adopted by traditional Marxism, fails this way. Quote, at the core of all forms of traditional Marxism is a transhistorical conception of labor, end quote, writes Postone. Footnote. Alfredo Saad-Filo observes, quote, according to the, quote, traditional interpretation, Marx's theory of value is not essentially different from Ricardo's. Published in, and that quote's from Alfredo Saad-Filo's book, The Value of Marx. End footnote. Marx's theory of value, by contrast, is about the social form of labor and capitalism and its consequences. Isaac Illich Rubin was among the first interpreters of Marx's critique of political economy to recognize it as a theory of the social form of labor and the products of labor under the capitalist mode of production. Quote, when Marx treats value as the social form of the product of labor, conditioned by a determined social form of labor, he puts the qualitative, sociological side of value in the foreground. The basic error of the majority of Marx's critics consists of ... the complete failure to grasp the qualitative, sociological side of Marx's theory of value. Footnote. See I. Rubin, Essays on Marx's Theory of Value, translated by Milos Smargia and Freddie Perlman with Red and Black Press, 1972. End footnote. Political economy, including the critical political economy, misses the phenomenological point that a provisioning process is inseparable from its constitutive social forms and purposes. Consequently, it fails even to recognize what needs to be explained. Why in capitalist society is wealth generally produced in the commodity form? Why are those societies where wealth is generally produced in the commodity form also capitalist societies? Why in capitalism is the production and distribution of wealth mediated by money? How does that matter? How is it that commodities and money are repositories of purchasing power, a peculiarly abstract social power? What is value understood as what money measures in the stores? Why is there no stable store of value? Why are commodities produced for the purpose of making profits? What is capital? Footnote. Samuel A. Chambers addresses this deficit in his book, Capitalist Economics, published in 2022. Marx's critique of political economy offers a guide to replacing political economy and the, quote, bourgeois horizon, end quote, within which it is confined. Simon Clark points out what is needed. Quote, there was a scientific revolution in 19th century social thought. It was inaugurated by Marx's critique of the ideological foundations of classical political economy, which Marx located in the political economist's neglect of the social form of capitalist production. Simon Clark, Marx, Marginalism and Modern Sociology, published in 1982. Replacing political economy and moving beyond the, quote, bourgeois horizon, end quote, involves renewing the revolution that Marx inaugurated, the investigation of the social form and purpose of capitalist production. Footnote. In our judgment, Marx's critique of political economy develops needed categories in a way that makes it indispensable. Marx is not the only resource in renewing the critique of political economy as critical theory. Thorstein Veblen, Max Weber, and Georg Simmel are among those who have much to contribute. Martha Nussbaum finds economics preposterous and threatening in equal measures. Preposterous, quote, "We have to grapple with the sad fact that contemporary economics has not yet put itself onto the map of conceptually respectable theories of human action. Indeed, it has repudiated the rich foundations that the philosophical anthropology of Adam Smith offered it. Sometimes it seems like an odd exercise finding subtle errors in economic theories of behavior when one's inclination is really to say, we can't even assess a theory this crude. Let's throw it all out and begin all over again." End quote. Martha Nussbaum, in the article In Defense of Universal Values, published in Women and Human Development, The Capabilities Approach, published in 2000, threatening, quote, "certain proposals in ethics, and especially in economic theory that present themselves as innocuous extensions of ordinary belief and practice could actually lead, followed and lived with severity and rigor, to the end of human life as we know it." End quote. Martha Nussbaum loves knowledge. I'd like to read some of her, actually. I think she has some interesting works on cosmopolitanism. She's not a Marxist, I don't think, but she's like a, I don't know, I don't even know what her politics actually are, but I think they're probably like some kind of social democrat. She draws on a different range of thinkers, I think, as well. Back to the text. As Clark adds, in the neglect of social form, characteristic of the, quote, bourgeois horizon, end quote, distorts social theory broadly, so understanding Marx's critique of political economy has extensive implications for philosophy and social theory. Quote, economics was not a term in common use in Marx's day. He wrote of the, quote, critique of political economy, end quote. We take Marx to offer a critique of economics. By economics, we understand any purportedly scientific account of the provisioning process or of human choice under conditions of scarcity, for which constitutive social forms and purposes are not recognized ingredients. Because every provisioning process has constitutive social forms and purposes, none can be understood apart from them. This is the lesson of historical materialism. In disregarding social forms, economics makes bad abstractions and phenomenological false moves. Lack of attention to social form leaves economics in the, quote, illusion of the economic, end quote. The misconception that there is an economy in general, where needs, wealth, labor, and production exist in general without any constitutive social forms. Footnote, see Samuel A. Chambers' book, There's No Such Thing as the, quote, Economy, Essays on Capitalist Value, published in 2018. End footnote. Martha Campbell observes that Marx traces the, quote, illusion of the economic, end quote, to the way that capitalist production presents itself. Quote, what is for Marx the extraordinary feature of economic activity in capitalism, end quote, is, quote, that it claims to create wealth, quote, pure and simple, end quote, and to be organized by this purpose, end quote. Martha Campbell, in the article Value, Objectivity, and Habit, published in The Constitution of Capital, Essays on Volume 1 of Marx's Capital, edited by Riccardo Belfiore and Nicola Taylor. End footnote. This deceptive impression gives cover to capital and helps explain the persistence of economics and the phenomenological errors on which it is based. New section. What are important terms in economics? Which of the following are important terms in economics? Property, commodity, money, prices, wages, profit, interest, or rent. None, according to economists Glenn Hubbard and Anthony Patrick O'Brien in their textbook Microeconomics. Wikipedia says Robert Glenn Hubbard, born 4th of September 1958, is an American economist. Glenn Hubbard was the dean of the Columbia Business School from 2004 to 2019 and remains the Russell L. Carson Professor of Finance and Economics there. Glenn Hubbard previously served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Department of the Treasury from 1991 to 1993 and is Chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors from 2001 to 2003. Glenn Hubbard is a visiting scholar at American Enterprise Institute, where he studies tax policy and healthcare. Glenn Hubbard was criticized for his reports and papers on deregulation during the 2008 financial crisis. Glenn Hubbard was also heavily criticized in the documentary titled Inside Job about the credit default swap scams that led to the 2008 financial crisis. So that's Glenn Hubbard. And I'm not really seeing anything too good on Anthony Patrick O'Brien. So, moving on. Echoing Lionel Robbins, Lionel Robbins was like one of the main people of like the London School of Economics. I think was pretty important in like, I'm talking my ass here, but I think he was pretty important in kind of like making marginalism the mainstream. Echoing Lionel Robbins, they characterize economics as, quote, a group of useful ideas about how individuals make choices, end quote. Glenn Hubbard and Anthony Patrick O'Brien. With its empire defined so vapidly, economics claims validity across the globe in human history. No wonder, then, that all the economic terms listed by Hubbard and O'Brien are ones that are generally applicable, like goods and services, not commodities which have prices, labor, not wage labor, natural resources, not landed property, and produced goods used to produce other goods, not capital as, quote, self-valorizing value, end quote. Making socially specific categories of ingredients would spoil the recipe and defeat the aspirations of economics to general applicability. In restricting itself to generally applicable categories, economics puts social reality on a Procrustean bed. General categories are scientifically inadequate. As used in economics, they suppress inescapable social, moral, and political content. Consequently, economics excludes, displaces, or renounces rational inquiry into normative questions, clearing the ground for its proud claim to be descriptive, not prescriptive. Economics gives positivism an alibi. How economics is conceptualized within the, quote, bourgeois horizon, and, quote, shrinks the scope of its discourse and its capacity to understand and explain. New section, bait and switch. Bait and switch is the rule in microeconomics textbooks. These texts announce a generally applicable human science, but leap in with, quote, unimportant and, quote, socially specific categories such as the commodity, money, prices, wages, profit, interest, and rents. Supply and demand curves appear, as if goods always and everywhere have prices. Paul Samuelson states that demand is tied to price. Quote, the quantity of a good that people will buy at any one time depends on price. End quote. Paul Samuelson, Economics. Yet Paul Samuelson erases price by reducing buying and selling to barter, eliminating the, quote, obscuring layer of money, end quote. Paul Samuelson. Quote, in the most advanced industrial economies, if we strip exchange down to exchange's barest essentials and peel off the obscuring layer of money, we find that trade between individuals or nations largely boils down to barter, transforming one good into another good by exchange rather than by physical transmutation. End quote. Paul Samuelson, Economics. Money, remember, is not an important concept in economics. Economics is schizophrenic about money, dismissing it where it exists, yet finding it where it does not. As with Gary Becker's ubiquitous, quote, shadow prices and, quote, opportunity costs. Footnote, quote, the economic approach is clearly not restricted to material goods and wants, nor even to the market sector. Prices, be they the money prices of the market sector or the, quote, shadow, imputed prices of the non-market sector, measure the opportunity cost of using scarce resources, and the economic approach predicts the same kind of response to shadow prices as to market prices, end quote. Gary Becker, The Economic Approach to Human Behavior, published in 1976. End footnote. But if we dispense with money and prices, what measures demand? It is easy to miss this point and conflate demand with desire, which lends economics a false plausibility. Eliminate all references to the, quote, unimportant, and, quote, socially specific categories, and what would remain of an introductory microeconomics text? Where would economics be without bait and switch? New section, 3 questions about wealth. Marx begins Capital by answering a question that economics does not ask. What is the social form and purpose of wealth? Marx writes, quote, the wealth of societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails appears as a, quote, immense collection of commodities, end quote. The individual commodity appears as its elementary form, end quote. Marx, Capital, Volume 1. Footnote. Marx's statement calls for a variety of qualifications, several of which we begin to explore below in Chapter 8, titled The Commodity Spectrum. End footnote. The commodity, then, is the social form of wealth in capitalism. 2 questions are familiar and commonly asked. How much wealth is there? How is wealth distributed? How much wealth is there, and how is wealth distributed? But a third question gets overlooked. Footnote. Below in Chapter 2, titled Recognizing Capital, Some Barriers to Public Discourse About Capital, we criticize Nancy Fraser's 1995 article, quote, From Redistribution to Recognition, Dilemmas of Justice in a, quote, Post-Socialist Age, published in New Left Review in 1995, reprinted in Nancy Fraser's book, Justice Interruptus, Critical Reflections on the, quote, Post-Socialist Condition. For focusing on the redistribution of, quote, wealth, addressing the second question, and neglecting the third, what is the social form and purpose of wealth? Writing in 2018, Nancy Fraser calls attention to the third question, quote, above and beyond the matter of how wealth is, quote, distributed, there is the problem of what counts as wealth in the first place, and how that wealth is produced, end quote. Nancy Fraser and Rahel Jaegi, Capitalism, A Conversation in Critical Theory. It's probably actually Jaegi. I know she's German, so it's Rahel Jaegi. Capitalism, A Conversation in Critical Theory, edited by Brian Milstein, 2018. Moreover, Nancy Fraser states that in Nancy Fraser's 1995 New Left Review article, quote, far from endorsing the black box view of distribution, bracket, which ignores the third question about the social form of wealth, in bracket, then, I was trying to clarify where it came from and why it was juxtaposed to recognition. I traced the provenance of both those categories as well as their mutual opposition precisely to capitalism, end quote. Nancy Fraser. In the appendix to Chapter 2, titled Letter from Patrick Murray to Judith Butler, December 16, 1995, Murray criticizes Butler for treating capital as wealth, thus not addressing the third question, and thereby not taking into consideration implications of the capital form for homophobia. End footnote. What is the social form and purpose of wealth? What is the social purpose and form and purpose of wealth? Asking it triggers perplexity. Economics misses, overlooks, or discounts the third question. That sets up the futile project of doing social theory without social forms, for there can be no economy in general. Marx's critique of economics comes to this. Economics fails to engage self-consciously with constitutive social forms and purposes. Economics fails to engage self-consciously with constitutive social forms and purposes. It ignores them, conflates them with generally applicable categories, and introduces them out of the blue in an unavoidable bait and switch. Marx attributes David Ricardo's, quote, ability to grasp the specific form of bourgeois production, end quote, to his, quote, obsession that bourgeois production as such, end quote. Marx, Theories of Surplus Value, Part 2. For Ricardo, a thinker whom Marx admired, capitalist production is, quote, not a specific definite mode of production, but simply the mode of production, end quote. Marx, Theories of Surplus Value, Part 2. Ricardo's mistake is twofold. One, capitalist production is not, quote, production as such, end quote. Yet Ricardo conflates them. And two, there is no, quote, production as such, end quote. Let me copy this down. Okay. New section. 2 questions about wealth and capitalism. A commodity has a double character. A commodity is a useful thing, and it is a value. Its value character is indecipherable if we examine the commodity. It appears as a useful thing, quote, pure and simple, end quote. Footnote. Marx notes that in the polarized expression of their value in money, quote, as the only adequate form of existence of exchange value in the face of all other commodities, end quote, commodities appear to be, quote, playing the role of use values pure and simple. Bracket, bloßen Gebrauchswerten, end bracket, end quote. A commodity's value must appear as something other than itself, namely money. Commodities are useful things that are values and have prices. Footnote, quote, everyone knows, if nothing else, that commodities of a common value form, which contrast in the most striking manner with the motley natural forms of their use value. I refer to the money form, end quote. Marx, Capital, Volume 1. End footnote. In Capital, Marx moves quickly from the commodity to value and then to exchange value, demonstrating that money is value's necessary form of appearance. Marx reasons from money to capital. Part 2 of Capital, Volume 1 is called the, quote, transition from money to capital, unquote, to answer these questions. What keeps the fires of simple commodity circulation burning? That's a great question. What keeps the fires of simple commodity circulation burning? Why do useful things keep being produced as commodities to replenish the market? Commodities keep coming into the market because they are commodity capital. Commodities are commodities whose sale brings profit to their owners, which is how capital can keep accumulating. In a world where the inputs to production are commodities, including the labor power sold by wage workers, production must begin with money. But there is no point in investing a sum of money to get the same amount back. Only surplus value, delta M, in the circuit of money purchasing commodities to sell for money. I was trying to say the M commodity M circuit, but money money transforming into commodities, which are then transformed back into money, plus more money, makes sense of a circuit beginning with M. Since capital is a value that increases its value, capital presents itself as, quote, self-valorizing value, unquote. The concept of value is essential to that of capital, but we see now why value presupposes capital. Footnote, quote, as the elementary form of bourgeois wealth, the commodity was our point of departure, the prerequisite for the emergence of capital. On the other hand, commodities appear now as the product of capital, unquote. Marx, Results of the Immediate Process of Production, which is available on this channel. End footnote. The failure of economics to engage the questions, what is value and what is capital, what is value and what is capital, reverberates through social theory and public discourse. Everyday talk about, quote, value added, unquote, does not stop to ask what is added. What is added? Such thoughtless talk confirms Marx's remark, quote, it is naturally still more convenient to understand by value nothing at all, end quote. Marx, Capital 1. Talk of human capital, social capital, natural capital, political capital, cultural capital, reputational capital, moral capital, spiritual capital, conceptual capital, and so on, reduces capital to a resource of whatever sort. Loose talk piggybacking on the shallow concepts of economics drowns out the needed critical concepts of value and capital from scientific and public discourse. New section. Marx's phenomenological critique of economics. The fundamental insight of Marx's historical materialism is phenomenological. There is no production in general. Production always has a specific social form and purpose. By phenomenology, we mean experience-based inquiry that determines whether what is distinguishable is separable. What is distinguishable is separable, like my shoes from my feet, or not separable, like my shirt from its shape. Drawing what David Hume calls a, quote, distinction of reason, end quote, involves phenomenology in this plain sense. Hume observes of a white marble sphere that we can draw, quote, a distinction of reason, end quote, or analytical distinction between the whiteness of the marble and its spherical shape, but we cannot separate the two. What we call factoring philosophy mistakes what is distinguishable for what is separable. Its phenomenological false moves create the, quote, bourgeois horizon, end quote. Footnote. We developed the idea of factoring philosophy in the book False Moves in Philosophy and Social Theory, Losing Public Purpose, published in 2023. End footnote. Phenomenological lessons can be broad. When he gulped down Hegel at age 19, Marx realized that form and content are distinguishable but not separable. Footnote. See Karl Marx's letter to his father on a turning point in life, published in Writings of the Young Marx on Philosophy and Science, edited by Lloyd Easton and Kurt Gudot. End footnote. The bifurcation between form and content is one of many that Hegel rejects. Quote, form and content are a pair of determinations that are frequently employed, by the reflective understanding (Verstand), and moreover mainly in such a way that the content is considered as what is essential and independent, while the form, on the contrary, is inessential and dependent. Against this, however, it must be remarked that in fact both of them are equally essential. End quote. Hegel, The Encyclopedia Logic, translated by T.F. Geretz, W.A. Zuchting, and H.S. Harris, 1991. End footnote. Marx likewise adopts Hegel's thought that essence and appearance are not separable, tracking Hegel's complex conception, according to which essence must appear as something other than itself. Marx argues that price is not value, but is the necessary form of appearance of a commodity's value. That necessity alone shows that value is not a generally applicable concept. Value exists only where the provisioning process is mediated by money. Marx's critique discloses where economics makes phenomenological mistakes by separating form from content or appearance from essence. Marx's major phenomenological claims include, quote, the substance, magnitude, and form of value are inseparable. Oh no, is this a quote? It's kind of like indented, so it looks like a quote, but I don't feel like this is a quote. I feel like this is kind of just the indent is for emphasis. So this is not a quote. Marx's major phenomenological claims include the substance, magnitude, and form of value are inseparable, so money is the necessary expression of value, and value are inseparable. No money, no value. Simple commodity circulation is inseparable from the circulation of capital. No surplus value, no value. Consequently, the liberal idea that, quote, the free market, end quote, has no compulsory collective goal is an illusion, as is the aim of separating the right from the good. Profit-making and boundless accumulation of capital disclose the truth about what transpires in the, quote, free market. Forces of production and relations of production are inseparable. End quote. Or not end quote, sorry, why did I say end quote? Just used to saying end quote at the end of an indented section. One second, I like that little indented piece. I'm going to copy that down. Forgive me. Marx summarizes his methodologically demanding phenomenology of capital's complex form, quote, in the completed bourgeois system, every economic relation presupposes every other in its bourgeois economic form, end quote. Marx, Grundrisse. Footnote, quote, capital is the all-dominating economic power of bourgeois society. Capital must form the starting point as well as the finishing point, ... end quote. Marx, Grundrisse. To present this totality, Marx takes a systematic dialectical approach in Capital. The book. End footnote. Relations that presuppose one another are distinguishable but not separable. So the metaphysics of causality between independent and dependent variables, for example, the conventional idea that value is the independent variable that determines the price, the dependent variable, is out of place here. New section, the, quote, Bourgeois Horizon, end quote. Marx's phenomenological critique of economics belongs to his broader critique of what he called the, quote, Bourgeois Horizon, end quote. The mindset of much modern philosophy as well as political economy and the, quote, bourgeois socialism of Pierre-Joseph Proudhon left Ricardians such as John Francis Bray and John Gray, the German socialist Gotha program. The, quote, bourgeois horizon, end quote, is established by phenomenologically false bifurcations, such as the purely subjective versus the purely objective, form versus content, essence versus appearance, force versus relations of production, the labor process versus the valorization process, and distribution versus production. Of Proudhon's mix of political economy, idealist philosophy, and, quote, bourgeois socialism, Marx writes, quote, Proudhon does not rise above the bourgeois horizon, unquote. Marx, letter to P.V. Annenkov, December 28, 1846. End footnote. Unlike a distinction of reason, a bifurcation treats as separable what is not separable. Marx's critique of the, quote, bourgeois horizon, end quote, was modeled on Hegel's critique of the kind of thinking that Hegel identified with understanding, Verstand, as opposed to reason, Vernunft. Marx quickly directed this critique of the bifurcating mindset of Verstand at Hegel's own philosophy, locating it within the, quote, bourgeois horizon, end quote. As Georg Lukács puts it, quote, Marx reproached Hegel, with his failure to overcome the duality of thought and being, of theory and practice, of subject and object, in the crucial point, he, Hegel, failed to go beyond Kant, end quote. Lukács, History and Class Consciousness, footnote. Lukács adds, Marx, quote, measured Hegel's philosophy by the yardstick he had himself discovered and systematically elaborated, and he found it wanting, end quote. Lukács. This interpretation of Hegel is a major point on which we question Marx's judgment. And that's always an important thing, right? Is like, a lot of times in Marx scholarship, a lot of times it's usually by Marxists and people who are pro-Marx. So they take a lot of his judgments about particular figures that he was in dialogue with as for granted as true. That doesn't mean that they're not true, but it requires further investigation into those figures itself, right? You can't just be like, oh yeah, Marx said this about Hegel, so it must be what is true about Hegel, or Marx interprets Hegel this way, so that's the correct interpretation. It's not that it's not important, and it's very important in understanding Marx, but it doesn't necessarily tell you that much about Hegel. And the same applies to people like Proudhon as well. Also, this is a point that Michael Heinrich, of course, makes, right? That, when doing his own research on his biography of Marx, he had to, dig into, I think it was in the reference to his biography, I'm pretty sure. It might just be in his Marx research in general, but, you have to take these figures that Marx is in dialogue with and in critiquing and in collaboration with at different times seriously as people in themselves, right? You can't take for granted that Engels is just another Marx, for instance. You can't take Marx's opinions of Hegel at face value as correct or convincing. You can't take his estimation of Proudhon or Bakunin for granted. You have to examine those individuals, the literature on those individuals, and the literature those individuals produced, in order to understand, to actually have a sophisticated appreciation of Marx's relationship to these people. Can't just take it for granted. So right here, when Murray and Schuler take issue with this interpretation of Hegel, so this interpretation of Hegel is a major point on which we question Marx's judgment. That's a good form of anti-dogmatic scholarship, I think. Of course, that's not to say that Marx necessarily gets a lot of anything wrong, but it just can't be taken for granted that he got them right. Anyway, end footnote. Marx's critique of political economy belongs to his efforts to move philosophy and social theory beyond the, quote, bourgeois horizon, end quote. New section. 3 types of concepts. We distinguish 3 types of concepts. 1. Generally applicable concepts such as wealth, labor, and production. 2. Socially specific, constitutive ones such as the commodity, value, money, wage, labor, and capital. And 3. Pseudo-concepts spun from the, quote, illusion of the economic, end quote. Footnote. We also discuss shadow forms, some of which are pseudo-concepts and some not. End footnote. Regarding the first type, Marx states, quote, "What is customary to say, ... in general terms is restricted to abstractions which had a historic value in the first tentative steps of political economy, ... Later they became leathery commonplaces. The more nauseating, the more they parade their scientific pretensions," end quote. Marx, Grundrisse. It is fallacious to reason from a legitimate general concept of production to the existence of production in general. Production in general is a pseudo-concept. General concepts are reasonable abstractions that identify features found in societies throughout history, but no society exists in general. Neither do needs, useful things, labor, nor production exist in general. Philosophy and social theory must distinguish these three kinds of concepts and employ the first two properly, while recognizing pseudo-concepts and avoiding them. Three fundamental concepts in modern social theories, wealth in general, utility, and instrumental action, are caught in the, quote, illusion of the economic, end quote. They presuppose an impossible economy in general. In an appendix to his book titled The Logic of Marx's Capital, Tony Smith writes, quote, I shall briefly and provisionally examine three of the most significant theoretical alternatives to Marxian value theory: neoclassical economics, Weberian social theory, and neo-Ricardian, Sraffian economics, end quote. Tony Smith. The Logic of Marx's Capital, Replies to Hegelian Criticisms, 1990. We take Smith to be dealing here with wealth in general, neo-Ricardian economics, utility, neoclassical economics, and instrumental action, Weberian social theory. Smith concludes that none of these three fundamental concepts has the explanatory power of Marx's theory of value. We agree, but we argue that these are not simply poor concepts, they are pseudo-concepts, since there is nothing for them to be the concepts of. We agree, but we argue that these are not simply poor concepts, they are pseudo-concepts, since there is nothing for them to be concepts of. These pseudo-concepts are not to be confused with the correlative and indispensable general concepts of wealth, usefulness, and purposeful action, with which they are readily conflated. The predominance of the pseudo-concepts of wealth in general, utility, and instrumental action represents a breakdown of social theory that Marx's critique of economics discloses. New section, Subsumption, Shadow Forms, and Fetishes. In disregarding social form, economics cancels three powerful Marxian contributions to social theory. 1. Subsumption under constitutive social forms. 2. Capital shadow forms, which are shadows of capital's constitutive social forms. And 3. The commodity, money, and capital fetishes. These are among the phenomena uncovered by the attention that Marx's critique of economics pays to the commodity, value, money, wages, capital, profit, rent, and interest. Social forms dismissed by economics as unimportant. New section, Subsumption. Having overlooked or discounted them, economics lacks the concepts for naming and investigating subsumption under constitutive social forms. The several types include formal, real, ideal, and hybrid subsumption. They bring phenomena under a specific social form, for example, under one of the value forms that constitutes capitalist production. Footnote: for more on subsumption under value forms, see Chapter 10 titled The Social and Material Transformation of Production by Capital, Formal and Real Subsumption in Capital, Volume 1, in Patrick Murray's book, The Mismeasure of Wealth, and Patrick Murray's article, Capital's Reach, How Capital Shapes and Subsumes, published in Capitalism's Future, Alienation, Emancipation, and Critique, edited by Daniel Creer and Mark P. Worrell. See also The Problem of Subsumption in Kant, Hegel, and Marx, a PhD dissertation by Andreas Sanz de Sicilia, for the Center of Research in Modern European Philosophy, Kingston University, April 2016. And Innovation Under Capital, a PhD dissertation by Shannon Walsh for the University of Auckland, New Zealand, 2022. End footnote. Here we consider just a few types. Commodification is the subsumption of goods under the commodity form. This form of subsumption creates what Fred Hirsch calls the, quote, commercialization effect, unquote, a transformation of goods that is dismissed by economics because it ignores the commodity form. Michael Sandel is among those political philosophers who revised the topic of simony, that is, treating what Thomas Aquinas called, quote, undue matter, unquote, as a commodity, thereby corrupting it. Footnote. See Michael Sandel's book, What Money Can't Buy, The Moral Limits of Markets, published in 2012. See Deborah Satz, Why Some Things Should Not Be for Sale, The Moral Limits of Markets. Elizabeth Anderson, Value in Ethics and Economics. And Michael Walzer, Spheres of Justice, A Defense of Pluralism and Equality, published in 1983. End footnote. Much of the literature that notes the philosophical and political significance of capitalist social forms restricts itself to subsumption under the commodity form. It is troubled about the moral limits of the commodity form. These important critical investigations focus on the simple commodity. Marx cautions us that the commodity is not simple. Quote, a commodity appears at first sight as an extremely obvious, trivial thing, but its analysis brings out that the commodity is a very strange thing, abounding in metaphysical subtleties and theological niceties. End quote. Marx, Capital, Volume 1. A commodity is a useful thing. There is, quote, nothing mysterious, end quote, about that, says Marx. And a commodity is a value which is a, quote, ghostly objectivity, end quote. Gespenstische Gegenständlichkeit. Marx's Capital, Volume 1. Marx makes good on his claim that the commodity is a, quote, very strange thing, end quote, first by establishing that the commodity is a fetish. As a value, the commodity is a depository of a peculiar social power, purchasing power, distinct from its natural powers. Second, Marx demonstrates both that the generalization of the commodity form of wealth is necessary for the circulation of capital, and the reverse is true. Commodity circulation presupposes the circulation of capital. So commodities are commodity capital, bearers of surplus value through whose sale capital reaps profits. The simple commodity and commodity circulation are neither simple nor so benign as they appear. Assessing them cannot be separated from assessing capital. In Chapter 8, we explore the complexities of, quote, the commodity spectrum, end quote. The spectrum includes basic commodities, capitalist commodities, commodity capital, ex-commodities, quasi-commodities, ideal commodities, and shadow commodities. What we call basic commodities, goods or services with prices, predate capitalism, as do most commercial forms. Money, wages, profit, rent, interest, and capital go by the same names, whether in non-capitalist situations or in the capitalist mode of production. However, Marx makes an important point in distinguishing how they function. Tony Smith puts Marx's point well, quote, the social forms analyzed by Marx in Capital are historically specific. Commodities, money, profits, and so on can all be found in pre-capitalist societies. One of Marx's fundamental insights is that these were not the same social forms as commodities, money, and profits in capitalism, although we use the same words. In Marx's Capital, Marx examines these social forms insofar as these social forms are moments of a social order whose organizing principle is the self-valorization of value. Footnote. That quotes from Globalization, a Systematic Marxian Account, published in 2006 by Tony Smith. See also Marx, Results of the Immediate Production Process, which is on this channel. End footnote. We call the modern form of commodities capitalist commodities, that is, commodities as they function in capitalism, in showing that simple commodity circulation presupposes the circulation of capital. Marx shows that the commodity as it appears at the beginning of Marx's Capital is commodity capital. In showing that simple commodity circulation presupposes the circulation of capital, Marx shows that the commodity as it appears at the beginning of Marx's Capital is commodity capital. Footnote. In the original text of A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, text, Marx describes simple commodity production, the market, as, quote, an abstract sphere of the bourgeois process of production as a whole, which through its own determinations shows itself to be a moment, a mere form of appearance of some deeper process lying behind it, even resulting from it and producing it, end quote. Marx, original text, text, and economic manuscripts of 1857 to 8 in Marx Engels Collected Works, volume 29. That, quote, deeper process, end quote, is the circulation of capital. End footnote. A commodity whose sale brings in a profit functions as capital. Not every capitalist commodity is commodity capital, for not every commodity in capitalism is produced on a capitalist basis. This is true of labor power, the crucial commodity for capital. If labor power were produced on a capitalist basis, it would be owned from the start by capitalist firms, rather than first being the property of free wage laborers. The commodities are produced in capitalist societies. Commodities are produced in capitalist societies by not-for-profit firms, governments, and the self-employed. They are capitalist commodities, but not commodity capital. Marx notes the tendency in capitalism toward commodification, including the transformation of labor into wage labor. Quote, in capitalist production, the tendency for all products to be commodities and all labor to be wage labor becomes absolute, end quote. Marx, Results of the Immediate Process of Production, or the Immediate Production Process. What is true of commodities in capitalism is also true of wage labor, which is a special form of commodification essential to capitalism. Not all commodities are produced by capitalist firms. Not all wage laborers work for capitalist firms. Quote, every productive worker, one who directly produces surplus value, is a wage laborer, but not every wage laborer is a productive worker, end quote. Marx, Results of the Immediate Production Process. Marx gives the example of soldiers who are paid a wage. Not all commodities are products. Though value is the consequence of commodity-producing labor and price is the necessary expression of value, the price form unleashes value such that things not produced on a capitalist basis, indeed not produced at all, can have prices. Quote, the price form, however, is not only compatible with the possibility of a quantitative incongruity between the magnitude of value and price, i.e. between the magnitude of value and the magnitude of value's own expression in money, but it may also harbor a qualitative contradiction, with the result that price ceases altogether to express value, despite the fact that money is nothing but the value form of commodities. End quote. Marx, Capital, Volume 1. Marx offers uncultivated land as an example of something that is not a product of labor, but can have a price. Wage labor is one of capital's constitutive social forms. Labor power, which is recognized as the property of the worker by natural right, is subsumed under the commodity form. Labor power is for sale in the labor market. Marx observes, quote, "The capitalist epoch is therefore characterized by the fact that labor power, in the eyes of the worker himself, takes on the form of a commodity which is his property. His labor consequently takes on the form of wage labor. On the other hand, it is only from this moment that the commodity form of the products of labor become universal." End quote. Marx, Capital, Volume 1. Labor is the use or consumption of labor power. In capitalist production, labor is aimed at production and accumulation of surplus value. Marx's, quote, value theory of labor, end quote, as Diane Elson distinguishes it from the classical Ricardian labor theory, rests entirely on the subsumption of labor under the social form of commodity-producing labor. Footnote. See Diane Elson's article, Marx's Value Theory of Labor, published in the book Value, the Representation of Labor in Capitalism, edited by Diane Elson. End footnote. Because commodity circulation presupposes the circulation of capital, the labor that produces commodities turns out to be wage labor that valorizes value. The labor of workers employed by capital to play a role in capital's valorization process is thus, the labor of workers employed by capital to play a role in capital's valorization process is thus formally subsumed under capital. Two familiar but historic features of this formal subsumption of labor under capital, are easily taken for granted. 1. Quote, "The worker works under the control of the capitalist to whom the worker's labor belongs," end quote. And 2, quote, "The product is the property of the capitalist and not that of the worker," end quote. Marx, Capital, Volume 1. Marx treats real subsumption of labor under capital in Part 4 of Capital 1, the production of relative surplus value. Real subsumption materially transforms production processes to extract more surplus value. This momentous phenomenon cannot be articulated when value and capital fall outside the discursive horizon, when capital goes unrecognized. Consequently, phenomena resulting from real subsumption are either ignored or misconceived. A popular way of misconceiving real subsumption under capital invokes the, quote, technocratic paradigm, end quote. It appeals to a neo-Weberian social theory based on the concept of instrumental action. In the book, The McDonaldization of Society, George Ritzer offers a neo-Weberian account of McDonaldization as the spread of instrumental action, with its values of efficiency, calculability, predictability, and control. But George Ritzer ultimately recognizes that fast food aims at increasing profit margins. Quote, "Profit-making enterprises pursue McDonaldization because it leads to lower costs and higher profits," end quote. George Ritzer. Shit, where am I? Lost my spot. Footnote. George Ritzer, The McDonaldization of Society. Ritzer is right that Max Weber argued that, quote, ultimately material or more specifically economic interests drive rationalization in capitalist societies, end quote. George Ritzer, McDonaldization of Society. We may speak of real subsumption without formal subsumption in cases where not-for-profit organizations, such as public and private hospitals or universities, quote, go corporate, end quote, imitating practices of for-profit firms with which they may be competing. We might speak of McDonaldization in such cases. End footnote. Phenomena such as, quote, efficiency, calculability, predictability, and control, end quote, popularly referred to as McDonaldization, are best conceptualized as real subsumption under capital. We can speak of the real subsumption under capital of the products as well as the production process. Though Marx does not introduce this category explicitly, quote, they don't make them like they used to, end quote, is a remark often heard. We take it to be an everyday observation about real subsumption, which usually involves cheapening of commodities and diminishing their quality. This diminishment is the theme of Ezra Pound's canto with usura. Pound echoes Marx's example of adulterating bread, quote, with usura, sin against nature, is thy bread ever more of stale rags? Is thy bread dry as paper, with no mountain wheat, no strong flour? Ezra Pound in Canto XLV. I'm not sure what that translates as. You can find it at the Poetry Foundation website, though. At McDonald's, quote, don't dare ask for a rare burger, end quote, Ritzer advises. What McDonaldized technology produce are, quote, flattened, featureless products, end quote. Ritzer. Along its path to stretching the profit margin, McDonald's food has undergone real subsumption under capital. In the same vein as, quote, McChicken and, quote, McRibs, USA Today is, quote, McPaper, for-profit schools are McEducation, corporate rock is McMusic, and so on. Mc is the prefix of real subsumption. New section. Capital's shadow forms. Capital's constitutive value forms generate many shadow forms. Footnote. For more on shadow forms, see Patrick Murray's article, Capital's Reach, How Capital Shapes and Subsumes, in the book Capitalism's Future, Alienation, Emancipation, and Critique, edited by Daniel Creer and Mark P. Worrell in 2016. And Dennis Badin and Patrick Murray's article, A Marxian Critique of Neoclassical Economics, Reliance on Capital Shadows Form. A Marxian Critique of Neoclassical Economics, Reliance on Shadows of Capitalist Constitutive Social Forms, published in Critique of Political Economy, a special issue of Crisis and Critique, edited by Agon Hamza and Frank Ruda, Volume 3, Issue 3, November 16, 2016. End footnote. If we fail to distinguish constitutive forms from their shadows, we may tilt at windmills. We distinguish between shadow forms designated by pseudo-concepts, for which there is nothing to be the concept of, and shadow forms that track aspects of value forms that stretch beyond their constitutive role. Some of the most important shadow forms are pseudo-concepts, quote, the economic, intended to refer to features of an impossible economy in general, utility, intended to refer to usefulness in general, and instrumental action, intended to refer to purpose of action that is indifferent to its ends and is efficient in general. These pseudo-concepts are fundamental to much social theory. They arise from the, quote, illusion of the economic, end quote, which, due to capital's ways of concealing itself, presents capitalism as if it were the provisioning process in general. In contrast, shadow forms with value forms, to contrast shadow forms with value forms, is not to dismiss shadow forms. Shadow forms matter in shadow forms' own way. That is true even of shadow forms that are pseudo-concepts. Shadow forms have ideological force. Shadow forms disguise realities that value forms disclose. Shadow forms are further manifestations of capital's power, extensions of capital's reach. Shadow forms figure widely in social theory, but only by recognizing capital are shadow forms seen for what they are, capital shadows. Capital shadow forms include the, quote, economic, utility, and instrumental action among the pseudo-concepts. But the list of shadow forms is long. It includes egalitarianism, indifference, nihilism, the calculative mentality, punctuality, gigantism, industriousness, the Protestant work ethic, secularism, and more. The rubric of capital's shadow forms lays the basis for a more complete theory of capitalist society. It opens possibilities for cooperative work between the Marxian critique of economics and other investigations of capitalist societies, which often are directed at capital shadows. Secularism is one case in point. Consider Marx's remark linking an enlightened secular mindset with the emergence of world money, a constitutive form of capital. Quote, as money develops into international money, as the commodity owner becomes a cosmopolitan... Let me restart that. Quote, as money develops into international money, so the commodity owner becomes a cosmopolitan. The cosmopolitan relations of men to one another originally comprised only their relations as commodity owners. Commodities as such are indifferent to all religious, political, national, and linguistic barriers. Commodities' universal language is price, and commodities' common bond is money. But together with the development of international money, as against national coins, there develops the commodity owner's cosmopolitanism, a cult of practical reason, in opposition to the traditional religious, national, and other prejudices which impede the metabolic process of mankind. Marx, Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, edited by Maurice Daub. End footnote. Compare Marx's comment with Max Weber's observation toward the end of his essay titled The Spirit of Capitalism, that the fitting subjective complement to capital's dominance is, quote, the ability to free oneself from the common tradition, a sort of liberal enlightenment, ... The people filled with the spirit of capitalism today tend to be indifferent, if not hostile to the church, end quote. Weber. In the article Spirit of Capitalism, which is in The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, translated by Talcott Parsons in 1958. Georg Zimmel's essay, titled The Metropolis and Mental Life, offers an array of associations between, quote, the money economy and shadow forms. Quote, it has been the money economy which has thus filled the daily life of so many people with weighing, calculating, enumerating, and the reduction of qualitative values to quantitative terms, end quote. Zimmel. In the article Metropolis and Mental Life, published in the book On Individuality and Social Forms, edited by Donald N. Levine. End footnote. Calculability, exactness, and punctuality are capital shadows. Though Marx does not develop this rubric, capital shadow forms have a root in his texts. In criticizing the Ricardian socialist Jean-Francis Bray, Marx identifies egalitarianism as a shadow of commercial society. Quote, Mr. Bray does not see that this equalitarian relation, the corrective ideal that he would like to apply to the world, is itself nothing but the reflection of the actual world, and that therefore it is totally impossible to reconstitute society on the basis of what is merely an embellished shadow of it. In proportion as this shadow takes on substance again, we perceive that this substance, far from being the transfiguration dreamt of, is the actual body of existing society. End quote. Marx, The Poverty of Philosophy. Egalitarianism is a shadow of the circulation of commodities, one of capital's constitutive forms, though the market is not generally recognized as presupposing capital. Equality is a constitutive social form of capital, as Marx observes, quote, the system of exchange values, and the money system even more so, are in fact a system of freedom and equality, end quote. Marx, Urtext. Egalitarianism stretches the form of equality beyond its constitutive role in establishing the moral equality of all persons involved in the commercial role of buyers and seller, borrower and lender, free wage labor and capitalist employer. The expansiveness of egalitarianism is represented by the use of the equal sign as a bumper sticker and by tying social movements to equality, as in recognizing same-sex marriage as marriage equality. Footnote. Postone sees the hard-won extension of more equal treatment to social groups previously discriminated against as going with the grain of capitalist universalism. These preliminary determinations, quote, these preliminary determinations imply that the extension of the universalistic principles of bourgeois society to larger segments of the population, that is to say, the realization of these principles, which has in part been effected by working class movements, as well as by those elements of the women's movement and minority movements that have struggled for equal rights, should not be understood as a development that points beyond capitalist society, end quote. Postone. George Ritzer's attack on McDonaldization targets shadow forms instead of real subsumption under capital. As Ritzer comes to recognize the four key principles of McDonaldization that he identifies, efficiency, calculability, predictability, and control, are shadows of the value forms. The value forms can explain McDonaldization, the shadow forms cannot. These shadow forms articulate the pseudo-concepts of instrumental action. They do not set out a coherent and reproducible mode of production. Caught within the, quote, bourgeois horizon, and, quote, Ritzer's neo-Weberian conception of McDonaldization skips over questions concerning the social form and purpose of wealth and its production. Ritzer's principles say nothing about why the products of McDonaldization are commodities, why McDonaldized workers work for a wage, or why profits animate their employers. There is no conceptual path from Ritzer's principles of McDonaldization to any social forms constitutive of capitalist societies. The path goes the other way. In the absence of definite social forms and purposes, these shadow forms presuppose an illusory economy in general. Marx shows why capital has an imminent drive to innovate, to accumulate, but Ritzer's principle lacks any coherent drive. McDonaldization is not about instrumental reason. There is none. It's about capital's reach. Postone comments on the shift of the Frankfurt School thinkers from the critical political economy of traditional Marxism to a critique of instrumental action, quote, lacking a conception of the specific character of labor in capitalism, critical theory ascribed its consequences to labor per se. The frequently described shift of critical theory from the analysis of political economy to a critique of instrumental reason does not, then, signify that the theorists of the Frankfurt School simply abandoned the former in favor of the latter. Rather, that shift followed from and was based upon a particular analysis of political economy, more specifically a traditional understanding of Marx's critique of political economy. End quote. Postone. Time, labor, and social domination. Where am I? The neo-Weberian critique of instrumental action operates within the, quote, bourgeois horizon, as do economics and traditional Marxism. Each is caught in the, quote, illusion of the economic, end quote. New section. The commodity, money, and capital fetishes. A commodity is a fetish because it possesses a social power not due to its useful properties. Car thieves want your car's purchasing power, not its horsepower. In explaining why a commodity is a fetish, Marx singles out the, quote, peculiar social character of the labor that produces commodities, end quote. Footnote. Quote, as the foregoing analysis has already demonstrated, the fetishism of the world of commodities arises from the peculiar social character of the labor which produces them, end quote. Marx, Capital, Volume 1. But neither the social form of wealth nor the social form of labor is a topic for economics. Excuse me. I think I skipped a sentence. According to Marx, the commodity is a fetish because it bears a privately owned, abstract sort of social power, purchasing power. Footnote. Marx notes how the strange purchasing power of money upset ancient society, quote, thus social power becomes the private power of private persons. Ancient society therefore denounced it, bracket money, and bracket, as tending to destroy the economic and political order, end quote. Marx. Capital, Volume 1. But neither the social form of wealth nor the social form of labor is a topic for economics. Without the concepts with which to grasp the peculiar character of the commodity, or the roots of its fetish character and the social character of labor, economics is in no position to recognize the fetish character of the commodity. Footnote. Georg Lukács writes of the commodity form, quote, at this stage in the history of mankind, there is no problem that does not ultimately lead back to that question, bracket, of the commodity form, and bracket, and there is no solution that could not be found in the solution to the riddle of commodity structure, end quote. Lukács, History and Class Consciousness. The ghostly objectivity of value, the commodity's fetish character, quote, stamps its imprint upon the whole consciousness of man, end quote. Lukács. End footnote. First, we set aside two sources of confusion in thinking about what Marx calls the fetish character of the commodity. Riccardo Bellafiore and Tommaso Ridolfi Riva sort out the difference between the fetish character of the commodity, and fetishism, which are often confused and conflated. In the classical Ricardian labor theory of value, value is conceived to be the product of labor, with no thought given to labor's social form. That is, to understand value as a transhistorical or, quote, socio-natural, end quote, concept. Marx calls this fetishism because he shows that value is, quote, purely social, end quote. Value is a consequence of production on a capitalist basis, not a historical constant. Fetishism is an error of theory. Fetishism is a mistaken way of thinking that belongs to economics and any social theory that neglects the social form of labor and its consequences. On the other hand, the ghostly social objectivity that makes a fetish of the commodity and money, writes Bellafiore and Riva, quote, is actually very real, ... What is deceptive is to attribute social properties to the things themselves as their natural attributes. This latter is fetishism, end quote. Riccardo Bellafiore and Tommaso Rodolfi Riva, The Neue Marx-Lektura, end footnote. Thinking that value is transhistorical is fetishism, a theoretical mistake. Thinking that commodities are possessed of the peculiar social power to purchase other commodities is no mistake. The commodity is a fetish in two ways that are easily confused. For Marx, it is purchasing power, the peculiarly abstract social power that the commodity packs, that makes it a fetish. Thorstein Veblen depicts how, in commercial societies, wealth functions as an honor fetish, a status symbol, leading to what Veblen labels, quote, conspicuous consumption, end quote. Under the rubric of, quote, sign value, end quote, Jean Baudrillard incorporates Veblen's insight into an expanded Marxian account of the commodity. Footnote. See Baudrillard's book for a critique of the political economy of the sign, published in 1981, and the article Consumer Society, published in Reflections on Commercial Life, an anthology of classic text from Plato to the Present, edited by Patrick Murray. End footnote. In addition to their use values and exchange values, commodities in a consumer society have sign values. Sign value bears some relation to use value and roughly tracks exchange value, as it reveals a further dimension of capitalist commodities. Economics ignores the double character of the commodity and the labor that produces commodities. The double character of the commodity as a useful thing registers the same phenomenon as the fetish character of the commodity. The commodity is a fetish because it is a value. The double character of the commodity generates a double consciousness. In a lead essay of his book titled The Souls of Black Folks, W.E.B. Du Bois invokes the term, quote, double consciousness, end quote, to describe the situation of black Americans navigating a world dominated by hostile whites. A black American is forced into a double consciousness, quote, always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in bemused contempt and pity, end quote. Du Bois, The Souls of Black Folks. What Du Bois does for black Americans, Georg Simmel does for residents of commercial societies, who navigate a world saturated with prices. Like contestants on the television game show The Price is Right, we experience our world with double vision. We size up the washer-dryer combo, the sports car, the week-long vacation in Cancun, knowing that each has its price. The double consciousness of participants in the money economy, Simmel contends, reaches into, quote, the depths of the soul, end quote. Quote, money, ... hollows out the core of things, their peculiarities, their specific values and their uniqueness, and incomparability in a way which is beyond repair. They all float with the same specific gravity in the constantly moving stream of money. They all rest on the same level and are distinguished only by their amounts, end quote. Simmel, the Metropolis and Mental Life. This, quote, devaluing the entire objective world, end quote, ends, quote, inevitably in dragging the personality downward into a feeling of its own valuelessness, end quote. Simmel, The Metropolis and Mental Life. Valuing, pricing is devaluing. Money, the, quote, frightful leveler, end quote, annuls the features that make useful things useful. Footnote. Marx says of usefulness, quote, "The usefulness of a thing makes it a use value, but this usefulness does not dangle in midair. It is conditioned by the physical properties of the commodity and has no existence apart from the latter," end quote. Marx, Capital, Volume 1. The devaluation that Zimmel links with money, one of capital's constitutive forms, is likewise brought about by one of capital's shadow forms, utility, a double whammy. Martha Nussbaum is stunned by how utility hollows. Quote, "Is a startling and powerful vision. Just try to think it seriously. This body of this wonderful beloved person is exactly the same in quality as that person's mind and inner life. Both in turn, the same in quality as the value of Athenian democracy or Pythagorean geometry or Eudoxan astronomy. What would it be like to look at a body and to see in it exactly the same shade and tone of goodness and beauty as in a mathematical proof? Exactly the same, differing only in amount and in location, so that the choice between making love with the person and contemplating that proof presented itself as a choice between having n measures of water and n plus 100. End quote. Martha Nussbaum, Love's Knowledge. End footnote. For Marx, prices are the feature of the fetish character of the commodity, whereby commodities, quote, far from being under their bracket owners and bracket control, in fact control them. End quote. Marx, Capital, Volume 1. For Zimmel, the hollowing effect of prices induces nihilism and the corresponding, quote, blasé attitude, end quote. For lack of attention to social form, economics is unable to recognize either the necessity of money in capitalism or money's fetish character, both of which are rooted in the social character of the labor that produces commodities. Money and the commodity are inseparable, since money is necessary for the polarized expression of value. The value of the commodity must be expressed in a quantity of something other than itself, money. Likewise, the commodity fetish and the money fetish are inseparable, because labor in capitalism is undertaken independently, with products intended for sale at a profit. Quote, men are henceforth related to each other in their social process of production in a purely atomistic way. Their own relations of production therefore assume a material shape which is independent of their control and their conscious individual action. This situation is manifested first by the fact that the products of men's labor universally take on the form of commodities. The riddle of the money fetish is therefore the riddle of the commodity fetish, now become visible and dazzling to our eyes. End quote. Marx, Capital, Volume 1. Because it is the universal equivalent, money does not need to prove that it has purchasing power, as commodities do. Marx observes of commodities, quote, we see then that commodities are in love with money, but that, quote, the course of true love never did run smooth, end quote, end quote. Marx, Capital, Volume 1. In its function as a store of value, or what Marx calls, quote, money as money, end quote, money seems to gain independence from circulation and become value incarnate. But money's independence from circulation is a sham. Quote, money's autonomous relating over and against circulation, money's pulling out of circulation, robs money of both money's use value, for money, bracket, here money is assumed to be gold, in bracket, is not supposed to serve as metal, bracket, and, in bracket, its exchange value, for money possesses this exchange value only just as moment of circulation, as the abstract symbol of their own value, which is reciprocally opposed to the commodities, as a moment of the movement of the commodity's form itself. As long as it remains pulled out of circulation, it is just as devoid of value as if it lay buried in the deepest mountain shaft. However, if money goes again into circulation, then it is at the end of its imperishability. Then the value contained in it perishes in the use value of the commodities against which it is exchanged. Money again becomes mere means of circulation. End quote. Marx, as quoted in Patrick Murray's book, Marx's Theory of Scientific Knowledge. Money is money bursts with contradictions. Money's independence from circulation is illusory. Quote, in circulation, money is always only actual insofar as money is given away. If I want to hold on to money, then money evaporates in my hand into a mere ghost of wealth. End quote. Marx. But if I return money to circulation, quote, it perishes in the use value of the commodities against which it is exchanged, end quote. To maintain itself as value, money as money must re-enter circulation, but this spending must take the form of investing. Footnote, quote, in the circulation of money, commodity, money, however, both commodity and money function merely as disappearing modes of existence of value itself. Money its universal form, the commodity as its particular form, its disguised form of existence, so to speak. Value goes constantly out of the one form over into the other without losing itself in this process, and it thus transforms itself into an automatic subject, end quote. Marx, Capital, Volume 1. When money re-enters in circulation, we begin a circuit with money. But what can be the goal of value in re-entering circulation except to valorize value's self, to increase in value, which requires completing a money, commodity, money, plus more money circuit, the circuit of capital. As the, quote, rational miser, end quote, the capitalist doesn't spend but rather invests. We have followed Marx in transitioning from the commodity to value, from value to value's necessary form of appearance. Money and price to money as a store of value, quote, money as money, end quote, whose claim to be value incarnate, independent of circulation, proved to be deceptive, to money that functions as capital, by initiating a money, commodity, money plus more money circuit. Capital turns out to be the truth about value. As capital, value is not a thing. Value is a process, a social form that comes to life as a, quote, automatic subject, pursuing value's aims of profit-making and accumulation. Thinking value through, starting with the commodity, leads us to capital and the capital fetish. Footnote. Riccardo Bellafiore presents this transition from value as commodities and money to capital as the process of extracting surplus value from wage workers as the transition from value as a ghost, commodity money, to a vampire. See Riccardo Bellafiore's shit. Accidentally fucking exited out. Man, that's annoying. What footnote am I at? Footnote. Riccardo Bellafiore presents this transition from value as commodities and money to capital as the process of extracting surplus value from wage workers as the transition from value as a ghost, commodity money, to a vampire. See Riccardo Bellafiore's article, A Ghost Turning into a Vampire, The Concept of Capital and Living Labor, published in the book Rereading Marx, New Perspectives After the Critical Edition, edited by Bellafiore and Finesci, Roberto Finesci. And footnote. The fetish character of capital is, quote, self-valorizing value, end quote, as an automatic subject appears most vividly when, as interest-bearing capital itself, becomes a commodity and perpetually lays golden eggs of interest. Like the fetish character of the commodity of money, the capital fetish lies beyond the horizon of economics. For economics conceives of capital benignly as produced means of production, nothing strange there. In missing the fetish character of the commodity, money and capital economics, and social theories under its spell, cancel Marx's counterpoint to the Weberian legend of the, quote, disenchantment, end quote, of the world. The modern world is not disenchanted. It is a capitalist world and is perversely enchanted by the ghostly objectivity of value, which proves to be the automatic subject that is driven to accumulate endlessly. The irony of capitalist enlightenment is that it rebounds in the fetish character of the commodity, money, and capital. The fact that Marx's critique of political economy nullifies Weber's, quote, disenchantment thesis by revealing that capitalist modernity is haunted by value and dominated by capital's drive to accumulate has largely gone unnoticed. There is no place for it within the, quote, bourgeois horizon. One second, I want to copy this down. New section, MacIntyre, Postone, Weber, and Marx, Instrumental Action or Capital. Alistair MacIntyre's book, After Virtue Begins, quote, imagine that the natural sciences were to suffer the effects of a catastrophe, end quote. MacIntyre, After Virtue, 1984, second edition, 1984. MacIntyre is setting up his claim that modern moral discourse has suffered a catastrophe, though one that has largely gone unnoticed. The catastrophe is signaled by the rise of emotivism. Quote, emotivism has become embodied in our culture, end quote. MacIntyre. Look up emotivism. Sorry, 1 second. Wikipedia says, emotivism is a meta-ethical view that claims that ethical sentences do not express propositions but emotional attitudes. Hence, it is colloquially known as the hurrah-boo theory, /boo theory. Influenced by the growth of analytic philosophy and logical positivism in the 20th century, the theory was stated vividly by A.J. Ayer in his 1936 book, Language, Truth, and Logic, but its development owes more to C.L. Stevenson. Emotivism can be considered a form of non-cognitivism or expressivism. It stands in opposition to other forms of non-cognitivism, such as quasi-realism and universal perspectivism, as well as all forms of cognitivism, including both moral realism and ethical subjectivism. In the 1950s, emotivism appeared in a modified form in the universal prescriptivism. Sorry, I was saying perspectivism is prescriptivism, excuse me. In the 1950s, emotivism appeared in a modified form in the universal prescriptivism of R.M. Hare. Back to the text. Feelings or gut responses, not rational deliberation, guide us. Emotivism decimates moral discourse. Emotivism asserts that there, quote, can be no valid rational justification for any claims that objective and impersonal moral standards exist, and hence that there are no such standards, end quote. There's a footnote that I missed. MacIntyre's description of emotivism fits mainstream economics, for which preferences take the place of goods. Quote, what I have suggested to be the case by and large about our own culture, that in moral argument the apparent assertion of principles functions as a mask for expressions of personal preference, is what emotivism takes to be universally the case, end quote. MacIntyre, After Virtue. And footnote. MacIntyre describes, quote, the contemporary vision of the world, and quote, as, quote, predominantly ... Weberian, end quote. MacIntyre. For Max Weber, modern society is unhinged from traditional moral moorings. Quote, Weber is ... an emotivist, end quote. MacIntyre. MacIntyre observes that, quote, a moral philosophy, and emotivism is no exception, characteristically presupposes a sociology, end quote. MacIntyre, After Virtue. Though MacIntyre is dead set against Max Weber's emotivism, the sociology of the modern world that informs MacIntyre's account of the collapse of moral discourse comes from Weber. Its fundamental category is instrumental action. Emotivism is the correlate of the instrumentalist assertion that there is a rationality of means, but reason cannot set ends. Emotivism involves, quote, the obliteration of the distinction between manipulative and non-manipulative social relations, end quote, writes MacIntyre. We argue that MacIntyre's diagnosis that modern moral philosophy develops into emotivism is distorted because the Weberian sociology that he adopts fails to identify and develop systematically the social forms constitutive of the capitalist mode of production. Weber does not cut to the quick of capitalist society. Instead, Weber is caught in the, quote, illusion of the economic, end quote. Moishe Postone argues that labor and capitalism appears to be and is instrumental action. Quote, it is precisely because of its socially mediating character that labor and capitalism is instrumental action, because the mediating quality of labor and capitalism cannot appear directly. Instrumentality then appears as an objective attribute of labor as such. End quote. Postone, Time, Labor, and Social Domination. Labor appears as instrumental action because labor's peculiarly abstract social form, quote, cannot appear directly, end quote. Wealth in capitalism is produced in the commodity form, and commodities have a double character. Commodities are useful things. This commodities have in common with wealth in any social form, and commodities are values. Value is the social form of wealth in capitalism. Labor in capitalism produces wealth in the commodity form. It is value-producing labor. Marx observes that value, which is congealed abstract labor that is socially necessary, is, accordingly, quote, supersensible, end quote. Quote, not an atom of matter enters in to the objectivity of commodities as values. In this, it is the direct opposite of the coarsely sensuous objectivity of commodities as physical objects. We may twist and turn a single commodity as we wish. It remains impossible to grasp that single commodity as a thing possessing value, end quote. Marx, Capital, Volume 1. Value must be expressed, then, as something other than value self, namely money and prices. So, commodities appear to be wealth pure and simple, and commodity-producing labor counts as labor, quote, pure and simple, end quote. Instrumental action, devoid of any determining social form. Footnote. Value follows the logic of essence, as Hegel conceives of the logic of essence. Essence must appear as something other than essence itself. So commodities appear, and footnote. So commodities appear to be wealth pure and simple. Sorry, I fucked that up. Where is it? Where am I? Labor in capitalism, however, is not labor, quote, pure and simple, end quote. Rather, labor in capitalism produces value and surplus value. Labor in capitalism is a socially specific form of labor with a specific aim, namely surplus value to be accumulated as capital. Postone is mistaken, therefore, that labor in capitalism not only appears as instrumental action, but is instrumental action. Postone's point that labor in capitalism appears to be instrumental action still holds. Quote, it is precisely because of its socially mediating character that labor in capitalism, end quote, appears to be instrumental action. But because labor in capitalism plays a socially mediating role, it cannot be labor, quote, pure and simple, end quote. Labor in capitalism cannot be instrumental action, which repels social mediation. Labor in capitalism is not instrumental action. It is surplus value producing labor, since commodities produced on a capitalist basis can carry surplus value. Because its peculiarly abstract form, quote, cannot present itself directly, end quote, labor in capitalism appears to be instrumental action. Labor in capitalism presents itself as if it were labor per se, labor with no social form or purpose. In capitalism, quote, instrumentality then appears as an objective attribute of labor as such, end quote, which it is not. Instrumental action is a fetish form. Of course, labor is always purposive, though it appears in capitalism as indifferent to its purpose. Labor's aim encompasses the socially specific goal of producing surplus value. By contrast, instrumental action is supposedly indifferent to its goal. Instrumental action purports to be an actual kind of labor, whether that kind is thought to be socially specific or not. Purposive labor does not claim to be a kind of labor. Purposive labor is an unsaturated concept, a general concept that applies to all labor, but is the name of none since there is no purpose in general. Consider Marx's treatment of the labor process in Chapter 7 of Capital, Volume 1, titled The Labor Process and the Valorization Process. The first section is devoted to the labor process in general. Quote, we shall therefore in the first place have to consider the labor process independently of any specific social formation. End quote. Marx. The fact that Marx states that he is considering the labor process, quote, independently of any specific social formation, end quote, reminds us that no actual labor process ever exists independently of some specific social formation with its constitutive forms and purposes. There is no labor process in general, but only in that impossible setting could instrumental action take place. Since there is no labor process in general, there is no instrumental action. Instrumental action is a pseudo-concept. There is nothing for instrumental action to be the concept of. It is easy to conflate the generally applicable category of purposive action with the pseudo-concept of instrumental action, which is one of capital's long shadows. Weber's sociology of modernity rests on the fetish of instrumental action. Weber fails to perceive instrumental action as an illusion because he does not recognize capital. Footnote. It is not as simple as that, as Tony Smith points out. This same pattern of being forced to recognize capital recurs in George Ritzer's The McDonaldization of Society. End footnote. Instrumental action purports to have no social form or aim, but there is no such thing. So instrumental action is a pseudo-concept, and the Weberian sociology based on instrumental action rests on a phenomenological false move. Like economics, it posits a labor process without any constitutive social forms or purposes, an economy in general, but the lesson of historical materialism is that there is no society in general, no wealth in general, no labor in general, no production in general, no economy in general. Thinking otherwise falls into the, quote, illusion of the economic, end quote. New section. Turning the key of Marx's critique of political economy. Social theory and philosophy and social science has experienced a collapse, also largely unrecognized. Social theory, notably mainstream economics, collapses the socially and historically determinate categories needed to understand life in capitalist societies into generally applicable categories, or conflates the two. Since those determinate categories carry the moral, social, and political weight, the collapse squeezes those meanings out of social theory. Morally, socially, and politically laden action reduces to behavior, leveling the field of social life for positivist social theories that exclude the normative matters. The fragmentation of modern moral discourse that MacIntyre bemoans is better situated in the collapse of social theory. That involves the ongoing failure to grasp capitalism in an adequate way. Instead, capitalism is misconstrued as a mythic economy in general. The hollowing out of social theory is exacerbated by the encroachments of, quote, economics, plural, imperialism, end quote. Footnote. Quote, economics imperialism, end quote, refers to the reach of mainstream economic thinking and game theory into the social sciences generally. See the two studies by S.M. Amadei, the book Rationalizing Capitalist Democracy, The Cold War Origins of Rational Choice Liberalism, published in 2003, and Prisoners of Reason, Game Theory and Neoliberal Political Economy, published in 2015. For a proponent of extending economic analysis into non-market arenas, such as the family, see Gary Becker's book, The Economic Approach to Human Behavior, published in 1976. For a critical approach to, quote, economics imperialism, end quote, see Ben Fine and Dimitris Milanakis' book, From Political Economy to Economics, Method, the Social, and the Historical and the Evolution of Economic Theory, published in 2009. End footnote. Social theory fails to engage the concepts needed to comprehend capitalist society. Emotivism, instrumental action, utility, wealth, and production do not identify any mode of production, but the crux of historical materialism is that there must always be a mode of production. But the crux of historical materialism is that there must always be a mode of production, and that each involves a, quote, way of life, end quote. The concepts of capital and instrumental reason both evoke nihilism, but in different ways. What is more nihilistic than the claim of instrumental reason that nothing in the world is objectively good or bad, right or wrong? Lack of respect for the person as a person is a criticism lodged repeatedly against utilitarianism. The same holds for instrumental action. Its presuppositions set aside the dignity of the person. Both utility theory and instrumental reason presuppose that intentions, emotions, and actions have no moral weight of their own. Their nihilism is teamed with moral nominalism. Capitalism and the social forms bound up with it are not nihilistic in these ways. Capital produces wealth in the commodity form, and commodities require buyers and sellers. Buyers and sellers are free property-holding persons, even if one's property is limited to, in John Locke's phrase, quote, a property in one's own person, unquote. That is, one's labor power, whose will, including their will is present in their property, must be respected. Buying and selling are mutually voluntary. Being free, possessing rights deserving respect. These values belong to capitalism's constitutive social forms. As Marx points out, quote, in order that these objects may enter into relation with each other as commodities, their guardians must place themselves in relation to one another as persons whose will resides in those objects, ... The guardians must therefore recognize each other as owners of private property. End quote. Marx, Capital, Volume 1. But mutual respect, even respect laced with indifference or antagonism, is contrary to what MacIntyre identifies as the key to emotivism. Quote, the obliteration of any genuine distinction between manipulative and non-manipulative social relations, end quote. A formal morality belongs to the social relations that make up a capitalist society. Intentions, actions, and effects have moral weight. Moral nominalism is out of place here. Capitalism is not so nihilistic as utility theory or instrumental reason. Emotivism does not capture the tension inherent in commercial relations. Buyers and sellers will pressure one another, but morality and law sets limits to the manipulations of persons. Marx contrasts pre-modern laborers, such as slaves or serfs, who are subject to, quote, personal dependence, end quote, with wage laborers, who freely sell their labor power but are subject to the impersonal forces of the labor market. Unlike slaves or serfs, wage laborers are formally free to leave their employer, but a recession throws many out of work against their will. The social roles of buyer and seller, including that of the free wage laborer, are formally egalitarian. The power of this egalitarianism continues to be seen in social movements for equality around the world. Footnote. Marx states, quote, the system of exchange values and the money system, even more so, are in fact the system of freedom and equality, end quote. Marx, Urtext. Still, there is a certain nihilism in the juridical person posited by commercial relations. The pure, There is still a certain nihilism to the juridical person posited by commercial relations. The pure, unencumbered self. Nevertheless, the reduction of the person to the pure self that comes with capitalist relations does not negate all values. Capitalist society is not emotivist at capitalist society's root. Emotivism depends on the untenable claims of instrumental reason. Emotivism and instrumental reason, like utility, are caught in the, quote, illusion of the economic, end quote. The illusion cast by capitalist social forms posits an economy in general, usually by mistaking the capitalist economy for an impossible generic economy stripped of all social valuations of useful things and all specific social roles and relations, along with their moral weights. Since the commodity form of wealth, which is integral to Marx's account of capitalism, is absent from both utility theory and the Weberian notion of instrumental reason, the moral implications of the social roles of buyer and seller are missing. Since there can be no society in general, there is no generic social space to accommodate utility theory or Weberian instrumental action. As imagined, such a space would be emotivist, with individuals left to assign values based on their own preferences. Because every mode of production is a definite and morally laden way of life, the social space of any actual society is never generic, never emotivist. Emotivism is an illusion spawned by capitalist social relations. And that's the end of the introduction and all that good stuff. 2, The Philosophical and Political Consequences of the Critique of Political Economy by Patrick Murray and Jeanne Schuler. The introduction had the specific title. What was the specific title? Introduction, Philosophy and Social Theory Beyond the Bourgeois Horizon.